They said it like a diagnosis, like a verdict delivered with a friendly smile. "You're too angry." The words landed in the crowded council chamber, where the microphone's red eye blinked, and the clock counted down her 2 minutes. She had rehearsed the facts, lined them up like stones across the stream names, dates, policies, the harm and the remedy, and yet what traveled farther than any sentence she had crafted was the heat she could not and would not hide. A man 3 seats down leaned back, performed a wince that said he found empathy distasteful, and whispered to a colleague. Their laughter fluttered like a paper fan in summer. When the gavel came down, the chair thanked her for sharing her feelings, a phrase designed to shrink a testimony into a diary entry. She walked back to her seat with her hands open, shaking off the old instinct to apologize for being human in public. The label followed her home, the way certain words do when they've been practiced on your back for years. Too angry. As if volume were the problem, and not the policies that had always made their way into her life like drafts under a door. As if clarity were an offense. As if a woman telling the truth about harm needed a permission slip to show she was calm enough to be credible. She asked the only question that has ever truly changed anything. What if the energy they call anger is precisely what survival has taught me? What if it is a muscle? What if it can be trained, disciplined, amplified, and aimed so it builds rather than burns? This is the story of how she learned to name her fire, carry it without apology, and hand torches to other people until a single bright spark became something like a sunrise, before she ever stood behind a microphone with the red light. Glaring like an unblinking eye, she learned quiet kinds of power at a kitchen table nicked with history. Mornings began with a radio low and a kettle that whistled like a patient friend. Her grandmother, who had taught school when the lesson plan included daily improvisations against small cruelties, stirred oatmeal with a wooden spoon that seemed to hold memory. She would say, "Keep your receipts," meaning literal proof of payment, and also the mental ledger you keep when the world wants to misremember what it did to you. Her mother worked 2 jobs and carried a binder that taught her to move through offices as if they were mazes she could memorize and master. They taught her to howl in private when the day demanded it, and then to step into public with the kind of composure that unseats assumptions. The neighborhood raised her as much as her family did. It was a braid of block parties and blocked opportunities. A place where a child could learn to dance and memorize the sirens' rhythms at the same time. Churches doubled as community centers. Barbershops doubled as newsrooms. At the corner store, Mr. Ellis kept an envelope behind the counter for families whose week had been too long for the cash in their pockets. On stoops, aunties sprouted like sentinels and issued advisories more reliable than the city's text alerts. Don't take that bus after dark. The pharmacy just restocked inhalers. A new officer's been posted on 7th, and he doesn't know our names yet. The air was thick with contradictions, murals about dignity on walls uninspected since the last inspector retired. Banners about unity hung by contractors who never hired from the block-dot school taught her the alphabet of expectations. A teacher asked in September if she'd consider leading the debate team in October. The same teacher cautioned her about being too passionate. A counselor praised her clarity and then, in the same breath, suggested she round the edges if she wanted scholarships, because donors liked their gratitude a little wet with tears and a little thin with thanks. She learned to thread needles. She learned that asking a precise question in the wrong tone could become a bigger offense than a classmate's lazy answer. She also found adults who saw her whole, teachers who knew how to widen a room to fit a girl who took up space out loud, elders who pressed her hands and said, "We've been waiting for this mouth." History did not live in textbooks so much as in casseroles and court summons. Her family told stories of Mars that smelled like sweat and hope. of strikes where whispers became chants, of nights when the phone rang and someone needed a ride. To the precinct. The city told stories too. A timeline of broken promises, bright policies poorly implemented, pilot programs that flew until they hit a budget. She grew up fluent in the dialect of maybe next year, practiced in the discipline of small wins. When she first tasted the word organizer, it felt like a recipe and a future. She also learned early about alchemy, the kind that turns grief into stubbornness and rage into resolve. When a cousin was pulled from a car for a taillight that had not been broken, the house filled with relatives and catalogs of what to do next time. When a neighbor's granddaughter was suspended for defiance after asking a teacher to say her name right, the women on the block wrote letters, fasting from sleep to make sure every comma earned its place. The lessons were not romantic. They were practical. Keep copies. Know the clerk's hours. Bring water to the hearing. Sit where you can see the bench, not where the bench can see you first. She absorbed it all, a sponge in a storm, and somewhere in that training a threshold appeared between her as a person navigating the system and her as a person who might change it. The triggering event did not come with trumpets. It arrived, the way most precipices do, quietly and then all at once. It was a summer afternoon, like any other, heavy with humidity, the kind of day when the sky feels like it's leaning on you. She left work early to attend a public meeting about a policy that sounded benign in the flyer and had the potential to cleave her neighborhood in two. The city called it a pilot, which is how experiments on people are sometimes dressed up when the people did not consent. The plan would shift patrol patterns, concentrate stops in a handful of blocks, target hotspots identified by an algorithm, and rebuild trust through visibility. Those words, she knew, could mean her nephew's walk home might become a roulette spin. She entered the council chamber and felt immediately what the room thought of her. Clips of conversations snapped like rubber bands. Here we go, from the man in a pale suit. We're going to keep this civil, from the chair, before anything had been said. 2 minutes each, from the clerk, although industry speakers are often granted entire afternoons. She sat, pen poised, pulse steady, and then listened as the presentation did what such presentations do, flooded the room with charts and euphemisms, overlapped language like fog, invited applause for intent while skipping over impact. A consultant said the word community 24 times in 12 minutes. Not once did he define which community, and for whom. When the chair opened public comment, she stood forth. A few people before her offered gentle questions. Could there be more youth programming to accompany enforcement? Had the city considered mentoring rather than ticketing? As if mentorship could fix how power moves through streets. She had planned to begin with a story about her neighbor's wheelchair and the officer who asked her granddaughter to prove the chair was hers. She had planned to end with a clear alternative, the budget that funded counselors who outlast crises instead of patrols that ignite them, the investment in streetlights that might save more lives than the newest gear. But when she reached the microphone, the room's posture moved through her like weather. She could smell the cologne of a row of men who smelled like they had never had to ask for an extension on rent. She could see a commissioner leaning back, with his hands laced behind his head. She could hear the chairs clipped 2 minutes, and she felt, suddenly, the reckless holiness of telling the truth. She began, "My name is," and she said it clearly, because names are a first line of defense. "I live on," and she said the block precisely, because specificity is a shield. Then she told the story she had planned, but she told it with the detail that makes denial harder. The day, the hour, the looking away of a baker in a window, the angle of the sun on the hood of the car, the words "calm down," spoken to a girl whose only raised voice was her heartbeat. She named the pilot for what it was, a plan to put people in slots an algorithm had decided they deserved. She used the words harm and accountability and refused to let safety be stolen by people who meant surveillance. She felt the heat climb into her throat and did not swallow it. She did not shout. She did not whisper. She steadied into a tone she had earned with years of being told to perform gratitude at the exact moment. Her dignity was being measured for shrinkage. When the timer blinked, the chair cut her off. She asked for 30 seconds. The chair pretended not to hear. She said, "I am finishing a sentence," and finished it, and the gavel came down with a sharp sound that made an elder in the front row flinch. It was then the words appeared, dropped from the dais like confetti designed to stain. "We appreciate your passion," said a council member, which is what people say when they want to strip a testimony of its evidence. "But your tone," said another, "isn't helping this conversation." The phrase came next, the one so many women in her line have been handed like a diagnosis. "You sound too angry." Her face went still. She knew that if she gave them the tremor, they would force the entire night to be about it. She breathed through her nose, the way her grandmother taught her, and returned to her seat. The man in the pale suit smirked. Someone behind him murmured, "Not a good look." Her neighbor took her hand and squeezed hard enough to return her to her body. The rest of the night unspooled like old film public comment, stacked with men who spoke with the ease of people who believed the room belonged to them. A vote scheduled, then delayed, then scheduled again. When the meeting ended, a reporter put a microphone in her face and asked, "Do you think you hurt your cause by sounding angry?" She smiled without humor and said, "I think anger is what tells the truth that comfort tries to bury." The clip aired on the evening news, not the one where she mapped policy to outcome, not the one where she offered a budget line for line, but the one where she said the word anger with a steadiness that made the audience lean in. Online, the comments arrived the way comments do, ad hominem and armchair advice, concerned trolling dressed like civility, the occasional blessing from a stranger who recognized his own mother in her mouth. A school board member emailed her boss. A donor called a friend of a friend to wonder if she might be alienating allies. She had not become controversial. She had become visible. The next morning, her son asked why people were talking about her like she had done something wrong. She made eggs and said, "Because I told the truth in a room designed to erase it." He nodded like children do when they are filing a note for future use. Then she went to work and discovered that anger is not merely a feeling you feel. It is a resource you can direct. It is a current. And currents can light cities. The first use of her current was not a protest or a petition. It was a living room. She invited 10 women she trusted, women who had been taught by supervisors and school boards and strangers at public comment to soften themselves into palatability. They arrived carrying casseroles and calendars. The agenda was simple. What do we need, and what can we build that doesn't ask permission? Someone brought butcher paper. Someone else brought markers. Her grandmother sat on the couch and eyed. The paper like it was a quilt she could already feel under her fingertips. They began with inventory skills before slogans. An auntie with a laugh that disarmed rooms had run HR in 3 industries and could read policy like music. A younger neighbor was a data analyst and could make a budget sing. A retired teacher knew how to run a meeting that ends on time. A nurse understood de-escalation like a second language. A college student had a gift for design and could spin a flyer before the kettle boiled. They placed each skill on a sticky note and arranged them into columns: legal aid, street safety, school discipline, media, mutual aid. The map that emerged was not a manifesto. It was a work plan. She named the group what it was not an organization. Built to impress funders, not a brand, not a resume line. It was an engine. They drafted a mission that fit on one line, turn our anger into actions that change conditions, not just conversations. They agreed on a rule that was less about optics and more about survival. No one would spend themselves empty. No one would give more than they could refill. They agreed to 6-month rotations for leadership, not because they feared ego, but because they respected stamina. They agreed to keep receipts in the practical sense document wins, track calls, write down who promised what and when, but also in the spiritual one. Anger is a ledger you keep, so you do not gaslight yourself. The first campaign was close to the bone. The policing pilot had returned to the agenda with tweaks that were meant to appease. The group trained speakers, not in how to sound sweet, but in how to command a room that pretends it cannot hear you. They practiced writing testimonies in story, policy solution arcs that no gavel can neatly sever. They set up a text tree so elders could get rides and parents could line up child care. They pooled money for 2 signs in gentle fonts. Our tone is not your shield, and we are here about outcomes. They printed pocket cards with questions any official should be able to answer. Which blocks? What metrics? What oversight? What recourse? What else did you consider? Who was at the table when you wrote this? Who will be there when it breaks? But anger is smarter when it moves on more than one front. While the public fight played out, they planted seeds elsewhere. They built a Saturday safety lab where residents designed their own block plans, who will walk elders home on the late bus nights, where to string better lights and who to call to make it happen, where to place a bench so kids could catch their breath, how to de-escalate neighbor disputes before someone called the number that escalates everything. They recruited barbers and pastors and high school coaches, trained them in conflict interruption and resource navigation, and paid them stipends from a mutual aid pot that replenished itself with small donations and larger ones from people whose consciences had been waiting for a direct debit. They set up a defense desk for school discipline. Anyone suspended for defiance could call a hotline that was really 3 phones in 3 purses, and get a coach who would help write an appeal, attend a meeting, and translate policy to plain language. They taught kids to say, "Please put that in writing," a sentence that opened doors none of them knew existed. They trained parents in how to ask for their child's records and how to read them, how to turn a mention of tone into a question about metrics, how to gather allies before they walked into rooms built to isolate them. They also learned to tell their own story, rather than waiting for reporters to frame their work as controversy. They pitched their own profiles, not of a leader performing anger for cameras, but of a collective performing discipline for outcomes. A young photographer made a series. Portraits of neighbors holding their receipts, not literal slips of paper, though some did, but the objects that proved what they were building. A fresh streetlight that snapped on at dusk, a laminated card with a hotline number, a binder of policy with a highlighter tattooed across the lines that always get skipped. There were setbacks. A grant they didn't want much anyway went to a well-meaning nonprofit that had not attended a single meeting and would call them months later for community input. A council member who supported them on Thursdays voted the other way on Tuesdays. An officer who had come to one of their safety labs resigned later in a press conference that used their name without their consent. Internet strangers trolled. Real-life relatives asked why she was making waves. She lay awake sometimes and stared at the ceiling and counted the ways the city could punish people who insisted on being heard. And yet, alongside the setbacks, there were satisfactions that felt like the sound of a window opening after a long winter. A grandmother called to say the bench they'd fought for had been installed by the bus stop, and now she could rest between the supermarket and home. Principal, previously defensive, asked if they would run a listening session that wasn't about venting, but about redesign. A young man who had once rolled his eyes at the word meeting began arriving early, setting up chairs and checking on elders' rides home like he had been doing it for decades. The anger they had been told to set aside became a renewable resource because they chose to circulate it. The turning point arrived dressed as a routine agenda item, which is often how real change sneaks in. The pilot program stood on the docket again, third on a list behind zoning and a contract to repair a bridge. They took their seats in the chamber. No signs this time, only pocket cards and practiced breathing. The chair opened discussion with a preamble about maturity and civil discourse, and she caught the sideways glance meant for her. She smiled without showing teeth and waited. Their speakers moved in concert. A father began with a story and ended with the exact line. Number in the budget that could be redirected. A teacher described a hallway at 2:17 p.m. and then the data that proved a counselor placed that would do more in a year than a car circling the block could do in a decade. A nurse traced a line from the noise complaint to the panic attack to the hospital bill and asked who benefits from such cycles. A student voice steady, hair braided by an auntie at dawn said, "Call it tone if you want. I call it knowing the names of people who will be harmed." When her turn came, she did not perform contrition for the last clip. She did not explain herself to men performing reason as if it were their inheritance. She said, "We wrote an alternative. It is in your packet. It does not ask you to be brave. It asks you to be specific." She walked them through the pages. Investment in lights on blocks where crime clusters with shadow. Traffic calming on streets where stop signs act like polite suggestions. Stipends for block stewards trained in de-escalation. A mobile team that would respond to mental health crises with care, not cuffs. A dashboard that would measure results in human terms and dollars saved. An oversight group composed of people not chosen for their love of microphones, but for their record of showing up. Silence has textures. This one was made of calculation and surprise. A council member cleared his throat, and then, to his credit, did the work of being persuaded out loud. "If we adopt this," he said, "we need metrics." She replied, "They're on page 6. Another asked, "What about high-need nights?" The nurse called from row 4, "We're piloting a rotation plan with barbers and pastors. It's in the appendix." The chair, who had once wielded the gavel like a corrector's rod, shifted in her seat as the room's gravity moved. Then came the moment organizers dream of and dread, a motion. Not to table, not to study, not to refer to committee. Motion to substitute the pilot with their plan for a 6-month trial with monthly check-ins and a midterm evaluation by people who did not owe their positions to the chair. The council voted. Hands rose, hands hesitated, hands rose again. The motion passed by a margin that did not erase the risk, but did redraw the map. The gavel came down, this time like punctuation at the end of a sentence the community had authored. The room did not erupt. That would come later, at the church hall, where someone would pretend to play a trumpet and children would take turns tapping the gavel on a folded napkin. In the chamber, they did the more radical thing. They stayed. They stayed for the next item and the next, because the work is not one vote. It is the habit of presence. When the chair adjourned, a council member who had once told her to lower her voice approached and said, awkwardly, "I'm learning." She nodded and said, "So are we all." A plan's passage is a headline. Its implementation is 1,000 footnotes. They wrote them one by one. Streetlights that had been on order for 3 budget cycles appeared on their blocks, and the night felt less like a dare. The bench at the bus stop drew small congregations at dusk, conversations flowering where once only waiting had grown. Block stewards, trained and trusted, carried radios and recipes. Sometimes safety is a pot of soup on a night when a shout threatens to become a fight. The mobile response team fielded calls that used to go to numbers that made hearts race, and they brought people blankets and breathing exercises and the kind of questions that de-escalate instead of inflame. The school discipline. Desk changed. Trajectories you cannot capture in a graph. A girl suspended for defiance returned to class with a letter that cited policy more fluently than the assistant principal. A boy who had been labeled disruptive for asking too many questions became the student who led the assembly on how to disagree with dignity. Parents began bringing pocket cards to meetings and leaving with agreements that stated not just "we will try," but "we will do." The data analyst updated the dashboard online, and the neighborhood began to see itself in numbers that finally told the truth it had been telling for years. When you invest in people, harm recedes. Not everything held. A funding gap opened when a donor's priorities wandered. They filled it with small bills and a bake sale that tasted like victory. A new official arrived and asked them to explain from scratch what they had proved. They resisted the urge to roll their eyes and gave him a tour instead. An incident on a block they had thought settled reminded them that no plan eliminates human frailty. They grieved, they adjusted, and they walked the block together the next night to show that presence is a policy too. Her life did not become easier. It became truer. She learned to decline invitations that wanted her to be a symbol without any of the substance. She agreed to panels that included decision-makers with budgets and said no to ones that cast her as angry voice against. A man in a suit who would leave with his career burnished by her labor. She started asking for stipends for community experts because exposure doesn't pay for groceries. She made a habit of bringing someone else to the mic every time she was asked to speak. Movements are not mouths alone. They are lungs and legs and hands. The clip of her being labeled too angry did not disappear from the internet. It did, however, acquire a sequel, another clip, where she stands at the same microphone in the same room, reading the first monthly report on the plan the council adopted from their packet. In this one, her voice is steady, not because she is suppressing anything, but because she is carrying something heavier than her own story. The weight of a neighborhood that has learned to insist that its emotions are evidence, that its anger is a compass, that its discipline is a craft dot. She began to sleep better, not every night, but enough that mornings came with coffee and not dread. She taught a workshop called The Uses of Anger, borrowing the phrase from people who had honed it before her and filled it with exercises that transformed heat into movement plans. She showed people how to write testimonies that would survive the gavel's impatience, how to count votes on a dais before you arrive, how to write alternatives so specific that officials must either adopt them or admit they prefer vagueness. She taught children to breathe through their nose when the room tries to make them smaller and to ask, in their own ways, who benefits from my silence? They said she was too angry. What they meant was, they preferred her quiet while business proceeded as usual. What they discovered was that anger can be a discipline, not a derangement. A tool, not a tantrum. A weather system that waters what should grow and washes away what should not have been built. She learned to tend it, to teach it, to share it, to rest it when needed. She learned that if you treat anger like a guest who must be tethered in the backyard, it will turn feral. If you invite it to the table and feed it purpose, it will set places for everyone who arrives hungry for justice. If you are holding a letter that shrinks your future, if you are standing in a chamber where your time is a clock and your life is a footnote, if you are being told by people in comfortable chairs that your tone is the problem, take this with you. Your feelings are not the opposite of facts. They are how facts live in a body. Write your testimony like a blueprint. Bring people who hold you when the gavel falls. Ask for what you want with the precision of someone who has read the budget. Build something that does not need the chair to approve it to matter. And when they say too angry, remember that what you are is tuned to harm, to possibility, to the pitch at which change begins. A movement is not a miracle. It is a practice made of breakfasts and binders and benches and budget lines, of voices that refuse to harden into bitterness because they are busy becoming instruments. The sunrise doesn't arrive because anyone allowed it. It arrives because night does not own the sky. Keep your receipts. Keep your breath. Keep your nerve. And when it is your turn at the microphone, tell the truth in a voice you can live with.